Number 1. The barn. We didn't have much money growing up. I grew up in the country with a brother and sister and a lot of cousins. This was a while back too, in the 1970s. We didn't have cable TV and could barely get any television shows on our antenna. Listening to music or ball games on the radio was pretty much the extent of our inside entertainment. Other than that, we tended to spend a lot of time exploring the countryside. I was the youngest of the children in my family. After my siblings had left home, my family moved into a smaller house to save money. It was even further out in the country than we had previously lived, but it provided a lot of new area for me to go out exploring in. Of course, all that exploring had to be done alone, since I was the only kid who was ever there, and no one really lived close to us. This happened on a pretty hot summer day. It was one of those days where it got hotter inside than it was outside. Plus, there was a pleasant breeze outside, and there would be a lot of shade out in the hills, so I decided to go exploring. I hadn't really had a real chance to do much exploring before then in the hills around the new house. Going off alone wasn't something that I was used to doing. I have to admit that sometimes, when you're out in the woods and alone, it can be a little scary. I planned on being out for quite a while. I walked up and down several hills, seeing all sorts of things out there. But something that really surprised me as I came over a hill was that there was a valley between it and the next hill, and there was a big old barn sitting down in it. I hadn't come across any other old buildings, houses, or anything like that beforehand, so I was quite a bit surprised. But I was absolutely intrigued and wanted to check it out. Although I had lived in areas previously where cattle grazed on the hills, there was nothing like that I'd seen in this area. So I figured that along with the old look of the barn, that it must have been abandoned. I carefully made my way down the hill. I was anxious to get down there and to take a look at the barn. Once I was down in the valley, I still had to walk a little while in order to get to the barn. As I got closer to it, I had a better appreciation for how large the building was. All I could figure is that they must have used to have cattle grazing there, and obviously a lot of it, if they needed such a huge barn in that valley. The doors on the barn were really tall, but there were no locks or anything like that to keep people out. There wasn't even a board like you see on barns in movies. Rather than a handle, it had a knotted rope hanging off each door, which I took for being the method of opening the door up. I pulled on the rope. Although it made a lot of noise, the door opened easily enough. It made me think that it must have been opened recently, which worried me only a little. I had no way of actually knowing if it did or not. There was a lot of bales of hay inside the barn. There was only one light coming from the door that I opened, so the back of the barn and the upper lofts were pretty dark. I made sure to open the door as widely as possible to get as much light into the barn as possible while I was looking around. I wasn't really looking for anything. There were some tools all around the barn. Some of them were on the wall. Others were on what I guess was a workbench. There were pitchforks and sickles and things like that. All were pretty old and just further led me to the conclusion that the place was abandoned and probably had been for some time. After doing a little bit of exploring on the bottom, I decided to take a look in the upper lofts. I really didn't expect to find anything other than more hay, but I was young enough that a part of me believed that I might be able to find something valuable, or treasure, or maybe even like an old diary or something like that. Anything that would be interesting. I climbed up to a few of the lofts and I was right. There was nothing in them but hay. I wasn't going to check the one out that was in the back of the barn, but since I hadn't found anything interesting, plus I wasn't really nervous, due to the amount of time that I'd already spent in the barn, I decided to go ahead and check it out. Each loft had a small staircase that led to a trap door in the floor. I approached this one, trying to be as careful as I possibly could. It was pretty dark there, and I told myself that I wanted to be careful not to slip or anything. I guess part of me was probably a bit scared of the setting as well. A lonely barn in a lonely valley, and me climbing into a dark loft was pretty terrifying. I slowly crept over the entrance to the loft, but decided to look around before going the rest of the way up. It was what I had done with the other lofts, but this one was a bit scarier, of course. It took my eyes a moment to adjust. It was a little darker up in the loft. I looked around a little bit after they adjusted. I was startled when I looked off into the corner of the loft, though. I jumped when I saw what looked like a person crouching down in the back corner. I had to rub my eyes because I was sure whatever I was seeing was just an optical illusion, because there couldn't actually be anyone there. I didn't have much time to react, though, because the crouching figure hunkered down in the corner of that loft quickly jumped on their feet. The action was so surprising that it caused me to lose my footing on the steps. I fell down the steps and landed, fortunately, on the hay-covered ground. Groaning, I looked over at the trap door to the loft. I saw a foot step on the top stair. I just lost it after that. I stumbled to my feet as quickly as I could. I didn't know who would be hanging out in the dark loft of an abandoned barn, and I really didn't want to stay there and find out. I raced out of the barn, not even bothering to close the door as I went past it. I didn't look back, not once, as I ran away from the barn. If whoever that was decided to follow me, I didn't want to know. I knew there was a dirt road that ran through the hills, and I just hoped I could find it. I had never run that hard, that fast, and that long in my entire life. I did eventually have to slow down because I was getting cramps in my sides. And when I did look back. If the figure had followed me, he either stopped or he had fallen far behind. I kept walking until I made it to the dirt road. Then I followed it back to my house. I never told my parents about what had happened. I would have gotten in trouble, probably for breaking into someone's barn. I still explored occasionally, but whenever I did not go into abandoned buildings, no matter how tempting. Number 2. School. I used to move around a whole lot when I was a kid, but it wasn't like across the country or anything like that. I lived in an area where several states were touching, and all of my relatives lived in that general area. We didn't really look at it as being different states, though. We thought of it as one main area. In fact, as I got older, I never really looked at the states like they were separate states with different laws and things like that. But I did have to change schools several times. And this was a more rural area, so a lot of the schools were older buildings too. When I was in the 7th grade, I switched to a new school in a new area. The school was very, very old. In fact, I think my grandparents had gone to that school, and it wasn't new back then. But there was a new high school being built on the other side of town. It was right next to the old high school, and when it opened, the middle school moved into the old high school, which was a much newer building than what we had before. After the move, the old middle school just closed up. Nothing new moved in its place, and they didn't tear it down. They simply boarded it up and left it there. It was out of town and by itself, so it just became an eyesore. I'm sure teenagers probably broke into it to go drinking or smoking pot, and younger kids would make up stories about the place, as if something scary happened there, and then they would dare each other to go into it or something like that. I never really thought much about it. I'd only been in that school system for a year. We moved several more times after that. When I was in high school, I was on the school's quiz bowl team, and we had one of our away games at that school system's high school. Our bus drove by the old middle school building, and I was surprised to see how badly it had deteriorated over the few years. I could absolutely tell that it had not been kept up at all over the years. After our match, I got to talking to a friend of mine on the team. I had left a lot of schools, but I never ever really went back to one afterward. I also really liked abandoned buildings, although my experience with them up to that point had only been old barns and sheds that I came across out in the woods. I'd never actually been in an abandoned building that close to civilization, but the real pull of it was that it was a school that I had been in years ago, and it would be pretty awesome to get inside and see how it changed since closing down. My friend Alex liked the idea of coming back later and checking the old building out. That was fortunate for me since I didn't have a car to drive out there, but he did. He also had some pot and thought it would be cool to be smoking pot in school, even if it was a closed down and abandoned school. It was Friday, and we came back later that night. As I mentioned before, the building was outside of town, so we weren't worried about getting caught. It was that fact that likely made it such an ideal place for teenagers and the like to hang out in. Though I had always thought they could just drive out to the woods. I mean, there was more than enough woods around in that area. We were able to drive up and went out to the parking lot that was behind the school. We had to get through a gate to get to it, but that was easy enough. We parked in the back, so if any police came driving by, they wouldn't notice the car in front of the school and get us in some trouble. I was excited the whole time because I hadn't been in that building for like 5 years. I was curious how much of it I would remember. We snuck in through a broken door, which was probably what most teenagers who might have hung out in there did. Once inside, the first thing I noticed is how much smaller everything seemed. I know that sounds a bit cliche, going back to an old school and seeing everything looking small, but that really is what it was like. There was a lot of garbage on the floor and things written on the wall in markers and stuff. It was typical stuff like Joey is gay and other such nonsense. I don't know if it was because it was years ago, or if it was because I had been to so many different schools in my life, but it didn't really seem that familiar. But I still wanted to have a lot of looks around the place. I had never been in the basement of the school either, and Alex really wanted to check it out. I had no problem with that, so I went with him. It really wasn't that much different than the rest of the school. There were hallways and doors, although a lot of the doors in the basement were closed. That was unlike the upper floors where most of the door frames didn't even have doors hanging in them. I was interested in some stuff I saw written on the wall and went over to read it. While I was doing this, Alex began walking down the hallway. He kept going up to the doors that had windows in them and looking in the windows. At no point, however, did he try to open up any of the doors. But I was only half paying attention to that anyway. "Holy shit!" I heard Alex exclaim. When I turned around to see him, I noticed a lot of things happening really quickly. First, it looked like someone was in the room that Alex was by and had tried to grab him. However, he was not grabbed and immediately came running toward me. As he did, I noticed not one, but 2 men coming out of that room that Alex had just been running away from. They started in our direction. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew that if Alex was running, that was good enough for me. I was still by the stairs and I bolted up them. I ran, skipping steps to get all the way to the top. I checked to make sure that he was following me, and he was, but I didn't want to get caught by whatever it was about those men that freaked Alex out. And thus I just ran until I got to the door that we had come in through. I just ran as fast as I could, trying my best to get to the doorway as quickly as I could, just to get out of the school. And I got out there, and I flew towards the car. Alex was right behind me. I guess he was either a faster runner than I was, or he just ran so fast because he was scared or something. We got into the car, and then Alex started the car up. "What were those guys doing?" I asked Alex, but he didn't answer. He simply hit the gas on the car and took off. I looked and saw that the two guys were out of the school building, but when the car took off, they stopped following us. We didn't stop to open the gate. Alex just drove through it. As we drove off, I kept asking Alex over and over what was going on. Why was he so freaked out when he looked in the room? Why were the guys chasing us? But he wouldn't tell me at first. He drove the car until we got pretty far away from the school. He pulled into a Kroger parking lot and stopped the car. He wouldn't tell me anything at first. He just kept breathing deeply and freaking me out. When he finally calmed down enough to talk, Alex told me what he had seen in the room. There were two guys that he had never seen before, in the room. He watched them as they were mutilating the body of a squirrel, and there were several other dead animals in the room. He got their attention by accidentally yelling. I told him that we had to go to the police about it, but he refused to drive me there. He just kept insisting that the best thing we could do was just go home. Over and over, and there wasn't much I could do about it. It was his car, and I couldn't do anything until I got home. When I got home, I called into the police of the town that the abandoned school was in. I anonymously told them what I had seen. Beyond that, I didn't really know what happened. I hoped then, as I hope now, that they caught whoever did that. I don't know. But then I couldn't follow the information on the internet, because this was in the late 80s and we didn't have that. I was also in a different town, but I didn't see anything on the news or read anything in a paper. I don't get people. I really don't. I don't understand the sick impulses people get. Number 3. Hospital. This story takes place on one of those haunted hospital tours. I'm not going to mention the name of it, however, for several reasons. The first being that I'm pretty sure that the staff of the tour were doing some things to make it seem like the place was haunted, tricking people into believing supernatural things were happening. However, this is just the way that I feel about the whole thing. I don't have any real proof, and I don't want to get any sort of legal problems. The only reason is because I absolutely did have a scary experience there, and if they really were faking some things, I don't want to give them positive publicity and attention either. Anyway, I was on the tour with a friend of mine. Now in the beginning of the tour, you followed in a group of about 30 people. The tour guide took us to each floor and told us the supposed scary things that happened in the hospital. I didn't know how much of it was real or fake at the time, although afterward, all the research I did showed that the stories were likely all made up. I had gone to the hospital with a pretty open mind. I mean, I didn't really have an opinion on the existence of ghosts before. I was just curious to hopefully come to a conclusion afterward. It did get a little more interesting, though, once we had visited all the floors. Once that was finished with, they allowed everyone to break up and have open exploration of the hospital. The majority of people went off alone, and they were trying to find any proof that they could of the supernatural. For the longest time, there wasn't much going on. Occasionally, I would cross by another person who was trying to contact a ghost in some way. Although I was open-minded about the possibility of ghosts existing, I felt the instruments that people used to try and communicate with them to be extremely silly. Spirit boxes and other meters and things that they used to try and detect electricity. I don't know, really. All I know is the idea of using equipment to detect ghosts was silly, because it couldn't be tested for validity. I mean, what is the point of trying to detect electricity to find a ghost when there is no evidence that ghosts cause pockets of electricity to exist? Anyway, I was interested in something that I could see with my own eyes. I had actually come across a few people who made some interesting claims. There was a very large room that might have been a cafeteria or something. One of the other tourists seemed surprised when I came into the room. He claimed that he had been calling out for someone for the past 15 minutes and asked if I had heard him. I told him no, I hadn't. I didn't believe him for the simple reason that he seemed surprised when I walked in, and also because he felt like I had to ask if I heard him. I think he was trying to make it seem like the spiritual presence of the hospital was silencing his voice or something. It seemed a bit coincidental that this matched one of the exact stories that the tour guide had told us. There were a bunch of other things that I was told by people, but unfortunately it was all secondhand. I was only hearing about other people having experiences, but not having any of the experiences myself. It was a bit of a letdown. It also made me doubt not only their stories, but the existence of anything supernatural. I mean, it didn't make sense to me that others could possibly be experiencing these things that they claimed, conveniently, when they are alone. Yet I wasn't. And then on the way out of the building, I was walking with a group of people. I was still feeling pretty let down at that point. As we were walking, someone grabbed my arm rather roughly and pulled me hard through a doorway into another room. I turned to address the person who had done this, a bit surprised, but not really angry. I mean, we were supposed to be in a haunted hospital, and I appreciated a good scare as much as the next guy. But there was no one in the room at all. My buddy who was with me came into the room after me. He thought that I had fallen or something, but when I explained to him what had happened, he believed me right away. And yeah, I was telling the truth, and we both searched the room. There was only one doorway to that room, and there was no one at all in there. A little shaken up, I was actually a little spooked when walking out of the hospital. My friend and I caught up with a group of people who were leaving the hospital. I don't know. Thinking back on the event does get a little worked up and scared sometimes, though I am grateful that it happened. It's something else to have an experience that you cannot explain. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.